first story we're going to talk about has got quite a bit of mainstream media attention, which is essentially that Qatar Airways have been kind of blocked from putting on more services to Australia. Now, this is a very messy kind of relationship because obviously Qantas would not be in favour, you would imagine, of more routes for Qatar because they're an international competitor. But Virgin themselves have a codeshare agreement with Qatar. So it's a very murky world. We've had a lot of developments on this, including today as we record it. So Jake, tell us a bit more.
Yeah, so a bit of background. Transport Minister Catherine King has blocked Qatar from bringing in more flights to Australia's major airports, Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. They wanted to increase their number of daily or weekly flights, but the minister has said no. She hasn't really said specifically why, only that it's not in the national interest. Qantas has been opposed to Qatar bringing in more flights, as you said, Adam. This is despite the fact that they are an alliance partner with Qatar as part of the One World Alliance. So Qantas has not wanted Qatar to be putting on more flights. On the other hand, Virgin Australia is again, as you said, in a code sharing agreement with Qatar, and Virgin has basically come out today and said that, come out the other day, I should say, and said that this was in a Senate inquiry on the cost of living. Basically said that blocking Qatar from increasing its services is hurting Virgin and boosting Qantas because Virgin, with its codeshare agreement with Qatar, as reported in the Herald, Virgin has about a 25% market share of routes from Australia to Europe and the Middle East. If Qatar's air rights had been expanded, this would have grown to 27%. So, more seats would have been coming into Australia, and Virgin would have been able to sort of get a slice of that pie. Qantas has a far more substantial share, I think 40-something% of routes to Europe and the Middle East, and that's also, they've got their code-sharing agreement with Emirates, which is a rival to Qatar.
It's a murky world here of
very
different relationships. Like you've got your ex-boyfriend, your ex-girlfriend. Somebody knows somebody else. It's all interlinked.
And Jayne Hrdlicka, the CEO of Virgin, has come out and said that this allowing Qatar to bring more flights into Australia would reduce airfares. International airfares, she says, are nearly 50% higher than pre-COVID. Additional Qatar flights would have an immediate and tangible effect in reducing airfares between Australia and Europe, the Middle East and Africa. Qatar is in the unique position in the context of a constrained global supply of wide-body aircraft. It can quickly make available 4 additional services per day to Australia. Hrdlicka says this would deliver much-needed and immediate benefit to the Australian tourism industry and cost-of-living relief to the Australian travelling public, including our own customers. Now, Qatar has, depending on who you ask, found supposedly some clever ways to sort of skirt this. For example, there was a story we did a week or two ago about supposed ghost flights that Qatar is operating. Basically, Qatar is operating a route from Doha to Adelaide via Melbourne, and supposedly on the Melbourne to Adelaide leg and the Adelaide to Melbourne leg, which it is legally not allowed to sell domestic tickets. Supposedly on these legs, the planes are flying almost empty. And, industry insiders told, I think it was The Guardian, that, this is a way for Qatar to skirt the rules because it's got limitations on how many flights it can operate to major airports, but Adelaide is not a major airport. So what it's really doing, these sources are saying, trying to get into Melbourne using Adelaide as the final destination. So, most of the passengers will get off in Melbourne and then the plane will fly almost empty to Adelaide.
I mean, the other thing, so firstly, in terms of the reason why Qatar were rejected, from what I understand, we don't actually, there's no definitive reason.
It's not in the national interest, says Minister King.
Now, the other aspect of this is that I think it was now 3 years ago in 2020, Qatar Airways was one of the only airlines in the world flying. In fact, they made a big kind of a PR marketing thing of this. They said, we'll take you home, we'll get you home. And during COVID, they took the kind of extraordinary step of actually increasing their number of flights. So when Australia shut the border and when Qantas and Virgin Australia were grounded from international flying, for a long time, the only way you could get home was through Qatar. And there was an incident at Qatar's airport, at Doha airport, effectively where a number of Australian women were subject to a kind of invasive search, which was a story quite a long time ago. Now, Qatar Airways, Qatar Airport, they're both essentially all state-owned, all effectively part of the same company. And this is something that's been going on for a long time because the women affected by this don't feel they've ever really got a compensation or that they've really got a proper personal apology. So again, we don't know whether this rejection is linked to that or not. Perhaps it's a totally separate thing, or perhaps the government is being cute in a sense by kind of punishing them but not overtly saying something. So it's hard to know what the motives of this are.
Yeah, I don't believe it has to do with the incident in 2020. There has been some scuttlebutt that the government is supposedly being, doing a favor for Qantas, but all this is just, dark conspiracy theories that are floating around. We don't have an actual idea beyond it's not in the national interest for why Qatar is being blocked. And Qatar is still able to operate its existing flights into the major airports, and it can, still operate into minor airports, again, like Adelaide. But there is at this stage, the transport minister is not allowing Qatar to boost its flights. And Qantas, by the way, has had something to say about this. Cam Wallace, the new international CEO of Qantas, has said that this whole stoush over Qatar, quote, completely distorts the broader dynamics in the market at the moment and how competitive it is. He said that, airlines like China Southern and Singapore have announced more flights in recent weeks than Qatar had been seeking. He points out, we have uncapped traffic rights with Singapore, the US, the UK, India, China, Japan, New Zealand, most of the nation's biggest trading partners and top destinations. He says much of the additional flying is coming from these markets. International fares, he says, have fallen materially since the start of the calendar year. That trend is likely to continue. This is a highly competitive market that Qantas has an 18% share of, so the idea that we are setting prices for the market as a whole is just false.
Well, it's interesting as well because we are seeing better than we would have imagined bounce back for international travel. Qantas now have added another 250,000 international seats as they're getting back to 100% of their pre-COVID levels. Tell us a little bit more about that, because one of the ongoing stories of the year is this domestic stagnation at the same time as international is kind of bouncing back better than we would have hoped.
Yeah, so it's not really, there's a couple of new routes or resumed routes coming in October, but most of these 250,000 international seats are from increased frequency on existing routes or using bigger planes. So, for example, on its route from Sydney to Bali, starting in October, Qantas is going to replace its 737s with A330s. Starting in July 2024, Qantas is going to be flying A380s between Sydney and Johannesburg. There's going to be more A380 flights between Melbourne and Los Angeles. There's going to be 9 flights per week between Sydney and LA using 737s and A380s. And from August, that new route from Sydney to New York via Auckland, which you might recall launched in June using the 787s, that's going from 4 per week to daily. And then you've got these new services from Brisbane to Honiara and Wellington, and Sydney to Shanghai is also coming back after 3 years. So Qantas is really ramping up its international operations by increasing frequency on routes and upping the size of the planes that it's using.
So it's interesting because, as we say, we've seen this positive news in terms of international bounce back, but we're still seeing more signs of a kind of stagnating domestic recovery. So we saw last week Melbourne's its pre-COVID recovery slip back a few percentage points, and now we've had Sydney come out and similarly post disappointing figures. In fact, they've said for the first time international has now overtaken domestic in terms of its recovery. Jake, tell us a little bit more about this, because that's the other side of the story.
Yeah, this is the latest chapter in the ongoing saga over takeoff slots. It never ends.
It never ends.
It never ends. We've got two stories. We've got two or three stories on this podcast that we just keep coming back to: air traffic control, takeoff slots, and sky kittens. Domestic passenger traffic for Sydney Airport was 90.6% of pre-COVID levels in June. In July, that slipped to 87%. Whereas the international recovery has, as you say, overtaken the domestic recovery, thanks in part to a surge of passengers from China. Now, Jeff Culbert, the CEO of Sydney Airport, has said that the airport is continuing to see evidence of takeoff slots, quote, going to waste, and that there is a potential mismatch between slots held by domestic airlines and the schedule that is flown. And we've got, and this has again been an ongoing saga. We've had all these airlines, Rex, Bonza, the main two, who have been saying, we can't get slots at Sydney Airport, or we can't, or at the very least, we can't get good slots at Sydney Airport, and we need these prime slots that are being largely taken up by the major airlines to better compete. In particular, Bonza has been essentially completely blocked out of Sydney Airport, and Tim Jordan, the CEO of Bonza, has said over and over again, we want to get into Sydney. We need access to the Sydney Basin, because currently the closest Bonza gets to Sydney is Newcastle, which, I mean, it's in interstellar terms, it's pretty close, but it's it's still pretty far outside of Sydney, and the services that Bonza has to Newcastle are not terribly expansive.